What a treat this is. I mean, we have a superstar panel here in honor of a superstar book. And I hasten to say, as a good promoter here, that books are available out in the corridor. But let me first thank the Clough Center and glad for his generosity and foresight has put this together. Let me also say that on December 8th, there is going to be another special program in honor of Mary, supported by the Rappaport Center, and that will be downtown at the Boston College downtown club. Let me just say a few words about our three panelists. They are people of enormous distinction. Heather Gerken is the Scully Wright Professor of Law at Yale. I knew her when she was back at Harvard. She's one of these people that wins not only all the scholarship awards, but all the teaching awards. And that's like Mary. That means there are no awards for the rest of us. But she's also one of the few people where the media respect her, and you can see her on National Public Radio, and she just does a super job. We're incredibly grateful to have from the University of Virginia, Jefferson's old university, Saikrishna Prakash, a great expert on the history of executive power in this country. He's obviously very biased because he was the James Madison Fellow at Princeton. So we know how he has got to come out. And finally, David Strauss, who has written one of my favorite books, The Living Constitution. And we're very fortunate to have him. He's the Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. Now, there's our panel. Now for Mary. Mary, we're so proud of Mary. And she published a great book. Those of you who haven't seen the review in the Wall Street Journal, it's a brilliant and accessible. Now, you know, Kant was not brilliant. He was brilliant, but not accessible. But again, like Heather, Mary has won the Slazewski Teaching Prize. She wins it again and again. But her book on the Transatlantic Constitution has won the Littleton Griswold Award, a very prestigious scholarly award. And she's just going from strength to strength with this book, which has just simply taken the legal history world by storm. So with no further ado, Mary's going to start off by saying a few words about her book and the project, and then we're going to move to the panelists. We're each going to contribute for about 15 minutes and ask questions of each other if they like, and then we'll open it up to you, the audience. Thank you.
I want to thank everyone for coming. I teach, and I don't mind the fact that in teaching people look at you. People may know I actually hate people looking at me. And my daughter recently was trying to pick a band instrument, and she decided to pick percussion. And I thought, that's an awesome choice. Like, you are important. You play a drum that matters, but no one can see you because you're in the back. And honestly, that's how I sort of personally would love to spend my career. I play the drum in the back. I want to thank Vlad and the Clough Center who supported this project in so many ways over the years. I just am so grateful, and for insisting that we do this this panel, and to Vince and the law school who have been enormously supportive over the years of my scholarship, and particularly this project. Dan's own outstanding book on the history of, okay, better? I have such a loud voice, now I sound very loud, of Harvard Law School came out this month, and I know we're gonna have a panel for him in the spring. And when Vlad and I were thinking of people who we'd love to have read this book, these were the three people who I very much wanted to have read the book. Heather is a leading scholar of federalism, and I think her most interesting work has thought about the ways in which the two stories of nationalism and state sovereignty that we've had cause problems for modern constitutional law. She's also the author, I think, of a series of vampire novels, and so I apologize for having no vampires in the book. Sai is, in my opinion, the leading originalist scholar, and I think he represents the best and most creative work in modern-day originalism, particularly in the intent-based school, which I think is the more persuasive strand, and he has a wonderful book on the executive. And then David seems to me to be the leading interpreter of, as Dan mentioned, the living constitution school. I think maybe more appropriately the common law judicial school that I think Justice Brennan understood himself to be a member of. He also wrote a wonderful piece about trying to think through how one would have argued for Madison in Marbury versus Madison, and so he was a particularly appropriate person to pick. And this book, I think, is a product of this community. At a very bad moment in this book, I was talking to Chuck Hobson, and he said to me, beware the fever swamp. And I wasn't quite sure what that meant, but I think it meant like I might go down and never come out the other side. And I've been sustained in the very low points of this book, of which there have been many, by knowing that many of you would have lunch with me, no matter how crazy the book got, and that you would talk to me in the corridors, and the students would still be willing to have me bring strange props into my property class. I think this book is also a product of this community in a way that may not be so obvious. And so let me just illuminate for people that there's a deep connection here to the Jesuit tradition. In focusing on note-taking, the book really approaches Madison's notes from an interdisciplinary field that's now often referred to as the history of the book. And the person at the center of that field was Walter Ong, who was a Jesuit who wrote a wonderful book called Orality and Literacy in the early 80s, and who was super important in thinking about the way in which writing is a technology that restructures our thought. And sometimes I wonder whether unconsciously a kernel that motivated this project actually came 1 year after I was hired, when I participated in a Jesuit seminar on Main campus. Many of you may have participated in that same seminar. And one of the readings was the autobiography of St. Ignatius Loyola. Not everyone in the seminar, I should say, read the autobiography of St. Ignatius. I did. I think we were actually supposed to get something different out of the autobiography of St. Ignatius. I thought we should have lots of fountains, since he seemed to think about the water. I think maybe the lesson was somewhat different. But the beginning of the autobiography begins with Father Luis González de Camara explaining that the way the autobiography came to be written was that he listened to Ignatius, and then, and here's what he writes, I went immediately to write it down, first in notes by my own hand, and later at greater length, as it is now written. And I have striven not to put down any words except those I heard from the Father, but in some things I fear I have failed, because in order not to depart from the Father's words, I have not been able to explain clearly the intent of some of them. And I know for the Jesuit community, thinking about how one reads the autobiography of St. Ignatius Loyola is very important. This is a funny year to publish a book about Madison and the Convention. It's the 228th anniversary of the Constitution, and I think my editor would have liked me to write the book a little bit faster, so we could have hit like a major normal number that people publish things on. 228 is not a year that the press had any interest in developing publicity around, but I've come to view the non-anniversary as peculiarly appropriate for a book that argues that the notes as taken in the summer of 1787 were not written for us. That is, they weren't written for posterity, because Madison, like the other members of the Philadelphia Convention, did not know they were going to write the Constitution. Now, people have viewed Madison as someone who was focused on posterity, but he actually didn't cooperate with his own death for posterity. This is one of my favorite stories about Madison. People may know Jefferson and Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826. And why there isn't a major American motion picture about that is baffling. Coincidentally, just coincidentally, Jefferson and Madison die precisely 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Nobody else thinks this is suspicious. Go figure. Precisely a decade later, in 1836, Madison's health was failing. And that summer, the physicians wanted to, and this comes from Dolly Madison's grandniece, they wanted to prolong his life so that he would die precisely on July 4th, 1836, which was the 60th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And they wanted him to take the necessary stimulants, which would have been opium, and then he could have died on July 4th, conveniently for posterity. And Madison refused. Madison refused to die the sort of perfect death for us, for posterity, and he didn't take the stimulants, and he died instead on June 28th. And you can see how aggravating it must have been for some people. Just a little longer, okay. And he was 85 years old. And after his death, his manuscript on the debates of the Constitutional Convention were finally published. That manuscript, now usually referred to as Madison's Notes, is one of the most important manuscripts in American history. And the Library of Congress catalogs it as a top treasure of the American people. I have to tell you, I've told people this story a million times. So it's actually top treasure number X. There's actually a number. And when I first got the images, the numbers on every single image, top treasure number X. And so I've always referred to it as top treasure number X. And in my book, I wrote at the very beginning of the book, it says, it's top treasure number X. And I send the manuscript to the library because I don't want to get in trouble because they've given me a lot of access. And they write back this, we do not understand how you have come to know that it's top treasure number X. And I get all worried, and I'm like, it's on every single of 530 images you sent to me. And they're like, okay, you cannot put it in your book. So I was like, okay. I was thinking like, what, they think there's people who are going to go around the world like, we've stolen top treasure number 1. Now we'll go after top treasure number 2. But you can figure this out for yourself, what precise number of top treasures it is. There are other notes of Madison's notes, but these are the only ones that cover every day. No other notes are as long, and I think more importantly, no other notes depict the convention as a political drama with compelling characters, lengthy discourses on political theories, crushing disappointments, and miraculous successes. And we have always thought of this manuscript as in some ways written for us, for posterity. And to a remarkable degree, Madison's notes create the narrative we've inherited of the convention. Almost every book and article about the convention has relied on the notes, and they remain the standard authority for historians and law professors, and with the rise of originalist constitutional argument, often lawyers and judges. And so the book is a biography of the notes. It argues that the notes do not date in their entirety to the summer of 1787, but that they were revised by Madison as he changed his own understanding about the Constitution, the convention, and his own personal understanding of himself. And it follows Madison as he wrote first a legislative diary that summer for himself and Jefferson, and then beginning in 1789, revised the notes into a record of debates. And it repeatedly tries to describe the distance from the events of the convention that occurred, even in the summer of 1787. And it follows Madison's triumphs and disappointments in the first months of the convention, and it shows how he fell out of favor at the convention and then was restored in part by copying parts of the drafts. And then it tells a story about even greater distance entering the notes. The book argues that Madison never finished his notes that summer. He became sick, he was serving on 3 committees, and he actually did what any, in my opinion, sensible person would do, which is he stopped taking notes and he focused on the work that he was supposed to do, which was writing the Constitution. And so only in 1789, when he's already in Congress, when he's already participated in the amendment process that gives us the Bill of Rights, and on the eve of Jefferson returning to the United States from Paris, does Madison suddenly think he should finish his manuscript. And at that point, he borrows
somewhat illicitly probably, an official journal of the convention from George Washington. He makes a copy, he uses it to finish and revise the notes. And the book goes on to tell how Madison continued to revise them, revising them in the early 1790s, trying to make the notes fit a little bit better with Jefferson's new Republican commitments. I believe that Madison understood his revisions as a repeated effort to create a record, his record, of what he saw as significant with the convention. But every revision, small and large, increased the distance from the summer of 1787. Over the years and decades, words, concepts, compromises shifted focus and took on new political meanings. Motivations were disputed and context lost. And from the moment the Constitution was visible on the final days, it was contested. And the understandings of the Constitution shifted over that summer of 1787 and continued to transform. The Constitution survived and eventually began to become the Constitution, which is how we understand it today. But Madison's narrative in the notes was always that of James Madison, a member. Thank you very much.
So I wanted to say thank you so much for the invitation and for the extraordinarily overly generous introductions. I do feel the need to make one correction, lest you think there are vampire novels waiting you outside for sale as well. I have written 9 vampire novels, but they are for an audience of 1, which is my 13-year-old daughter. So I just want to say what an intensely interesting read this was. I think this book is as lively and engaging as your colleague is. And no one, I think, could be anything but impressed with the care and intelligence with which Professor Bilder reads Madison's notes. It takes an incredibly varied skill set to pull off a book like this one. One has to be able to spend an inordinate amount of time focused on the trees, even the leaves, even the tiny beetles on the leaves, and yet still know enough about the forest to situate the work as she does. So let me just give one example. Professor Bilder identifies when Madison is actually making cryptic comments about the political dynamics. And she also has enough distance to recognize the dynamics surrounding Virginia's special power that Madison himself cannot recognize as he records these notes. There are delights, large and small, scattered throughout the book. And these are especially delightful because I think that, like most academics, I have a soft spot for Madison. I think we value him because he was smart, even prescient. We value him for reasons that I suspect most people wouldn't. That is because even when he is spectacularly wrong, he is still interesting. I took delight in the small asides, the fact that Madison, who understood himself as an outsider to Virginia politics, couldn't understand why others treated him as a self-interested Virginian. I love that he deliberately papered over his own procedural missteps because he was embarrassed by them. I love that he thinks through writing. I love the small and slightly snippy aside that notes that Madison began to see a great deal less of Thomas Jefferson after Dolly Madison entered his life. Professor Bilder does such a good job of pulling us into the convention that I found myself reading these delicate asides and doing something that I sometimes do during faculty meetings, which is classifying people based on which house in Harry Potter they would reside. So, George Washington is a Gryffindor, but Professor Bilder reminds us why Gryffindors are not always popular. Madison seemed pure Ravenclaw to me, and it turns out that Ben Franklin is a Hufflepuff, and Jefferson is a Slytherin through and through. So what I'd like to offer from this really wonderful book is less a critique of the book and more of a commentary, something meant both as a compliment and a complement to the book. Because Professor Bilder, good historian that she is, confines herself to presenting her findings in an even-handed and careful way without going beyond what she can tell. But I, law professor that I am, feel free to depart from the materials in order to talk about the impact of the book. And here I want to talk about what I think will be the core worry that this book raises. What do we make of the fact that James Madison is an unreliable narrator? What do we make of the fact that his notes, on which many have relied, have been changed and altered in self-interested ways? What do we make of the fact that he adjusted what are supposed to be a faithful record of the convention in both an unconscious and an unself-conscious fashion? That he papers over controversy and shows what Professor Bilder at some point calls a discomfiting willingness to conceal his own responsibility for his own mistakes? What do we think of the fact that his story apparently changed not only due to his own effort to paint his place in history, but due to Jefferson's pernicious influence? Now, I suspect that most people outside of history would be shocked to discover this. I imagine that some of you will be surprised, even disappointed in Madison. And for those of you who don't like originalism, I imagine you will be tempted to pounce. To be sure, the read the mind of the framers variant of originalism is now passé, but still, if the views are one person, are this hard to entangle, how do we gauge the views of a nation? Moreover, the book makes clear that there is a gap between the original public meaning of the Constitution and the true intent of the framers. As things were passed, we discover through the book for reasons that we might not guess from the text. None of these reactions, it seems to me, is the right one. What this book reveals isn't that Madison is dishonest or an operator. What this book reveals is that he is human. We are all unreliable narrators, and by we, I mean we as individuals and we as a collective. So for those of you who might be shocked that Madison is an unreliable narrator, I urge you to think back to your first class in constitutional law and the great Chief Justice Marshall. He is, in fact, the first voice that most students encounter when they enter constitutional law. And if there were ever an unreliable narrator of our constitutional tradition, it is Chief Justice Marshall. Just think about Marbury, where he tells us you can never have a right without a remedy, and then proceeds to recognize a right without a remedy in the selfsame case, and meanwhile doesn't tell us that it was his idiot brother who failed to deliver poor Marbury's commission at the Chief Justice's own behest. Or think of his opinion in Gibbons versus Ogden, where Marshall insists that there are state activities that don't affect interstate commerce, and then proceeds to debunk the very same examples he's offered in a few short paragraphs later. Or Marshall's opinion in McCulloch, where he insists that nobody could possibly believe that Congress lacked the power to incorporate the second bank of the United States, even though he knew full well that there was an intense debate over this question in the first debate. And here, too, I suppose Madison proves unreliable since he opposed the first, but the War of 1812 presumably gave him a slightly different perspective on that question. Now, before you start to feel too smug, it is worth noting that cutting-edge work in psychology suggests that we are all unreliable narrators. Memories are constructed much the way Madison's notes were. Fragments and moments are organized into a storyline, which in turn leads us to discard some memories and overestimate the importance of other. We think that the way to understand a story is to start at the beginning. But our memories work quite differently. We start with the end, and we work our way backwards, reorganizing and misremembering and sometimes even inventing details, all in furtherance of what we take to be the deeper truth, which is the meaning of all those memories taken together. None of this suggests malice or even self-conscious efforts to reconstruct the past. It just suggests that we're human. And what happens on a human scale happens on a national one as well. What happened to Madison's notes has happened to our collective memory of our own history. We, as a collective, are completely unreliable narrators. Many of us, for example, think that equality is a deep-seated part of our history, but very little in our past would suggest that to be true. Set aside the world of the framers, where most of the people in this room could not take part in civic life because of our gender or our race or our lack of property. It took us more than our century for our supposedly egalitarian democracy to enforce the hard-won equality mandates that emerged from the Civil War. Now, I suspect most of you know that one, but let me give you another example of where we've reinvented our past for many of our constitutional amendments, as I will just say the brilliant David Strauss has described in his book on common law constitutionalism, which is also one of my favorites. I suspect most of you think, for instance, that we have a fine tradition of separating church and state thanks to the First Amendment, and I'll just tell you that is complete nonsense. The First Amendment was originally intended to prevent the federal government from establishing one religion to rule them all, with apologies to Tolkien. But the states were supposed to be free to establish their own churches. Our self-understanding then, which is inscribed in our opinions, turns out to be a myth. And here again, I mean this observation not as a critique. Myth-making isn't just a tradition for us, but a grand tradition. Sometimes we need to invent a past in order to move toward our future. And these national myths are actually the sort of myths that individuals create when they remember, and that Madison created when he revised his notes over and over and over, as he took a greater distance from the convention, but I think a closer sense of why it mattered. Madison created exactly the same thing that Stephen King says we create when we write fiction. Stephen King says that fiction is the truth inside a lie. And the myths that we often deploy stand in for deep truths, even when the account of the past is not entirely truthful. My point then is that a book like this should not lead us to abandon the past or to discard it as useless, nor should we engage in the cynical, instrumental effort to find what academics rightly condemn as a usable past. We should instead approach our past with humility. We should recognize that our past is plural, and the bit of pluralism is in order whenever we talk about it. We should recognize that we are all, like Madison, unreliable narrators, and perhaps that's not such a bad thing. The past, after all, supplies the language in which we cast our present truths. Thank you very much.
Well, I have the misfortune of following Mary and Heather, and I guess it's my misfortune. I want to thank you folks for inviting me here, and it speaks to the strength and the virtues of Mary's book that so many of you are here today, so late in the afternoon. I have to say, this book is absolutely wonderful. I enjoyed reading it once, and now I'm on my second time around. It reflects so much work and so much care on Mary's part. It's so well written. I just can't imagine, how many days, weeks, months, years. I think she said 2007 is when she started, that she poured into this book. And I can say that I'm not the only one who thinks this. There's the Wall Street Journal Review, but I was in my lunch cafeteria just 2 days ago, talking about a class with my colleague, and at the other table was my colleague John Harrison. And John was holding forth about how incredible this book was. And he was speaking in gleeful tones about how much, what Mary had found and the interesting insights that the book reveals about Madison's notes. And the sort of one of the odd things about the book, it's odd to me, or maybe it's not odd, it just reflects Mary's humility. It's hard to figure out what new claims she's making because she doesn't tell us that they're new, but there are a lot of them in the book. It's a testament to your modesty that you don't sort of make what you're saying that's new crystal clear, I think, at least for my taste. So, Mary tells us that Madison took shorthand notes and then rewrote them days later. I had no idea that had happened. Mary tells us that Madison revised the speeches that he made in the convention a year or 2 or 3 after the fact, and put them in the notes, and apparently took out old notes. And then finally she tells us that Madison didn't contemporaneously rewrite his shorthand notes while he was at Philadelphia for the portions of the debate that extend from August to September. And all 3 of these facts are incredibly interesting. We can take them in various ways. I think Heather takes them in the most positive way to Madison, that he's just, rethinking these things. And of course, we can't always be accurate when we revise our notes. But of course, others will be more skeptical about what's going on, and I think there's some skepticism in Mary's book. I have to say, after reading this book, I think of Mary as a combination of Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, and Nancy Drew. Because there's that much work in this book. I mean, it's just ridiculous the amount of work that she must have done to look at all these watermarks and to read the letters that are written contemporaneously with the debates of a particular day to see if the watermarks match up. And then it is just phenomenal, and it's a life's achievement. So I'm going to use Mary's title just to talk about 3 or 4 different things. And so first I want to talk about Madison's audience. Who was Madison writing these notes for? And Mary says he wasn't writing them for us. He was writing them for himself. And then she says he was writing them for Thomas Jefferson, his friend. And she recounts how Madison wrote notes while he was a member of the Continental Congress. And she points out that Madison shared those notes with Jefferson, but also with some folks in Virginia, Edmund Randolph, I think a fellow named Joseph Jones, and a couple of others as well. And of course, Madison eventually shares the convention notes with Thomas Jefferson. But Mary also points out that he wrote letters while at the convention to some folks in Virginia, and we don't have those letters. And so you kind of wonder what he was telling them. She suspects, or she suggests, that maybe he or they burned those letters to prevent them from being revealed. There was a cone of silence over the convention. I don't know how many of you watched Get Smart as a kid, but basically the delegates weren't allowed to talk about what was going on in the convention, because the idea was, I think, that people will be freer in their thoughts and in their discussions if they don't fear the possibility that the Philadelphia papers will print what they're saying the next day. And so the idea is we're going to keep things quiet, and so we can say what we really think, and then maybe later on we can talk about this. But I wonder if it really is the case that Madison wrote this just for himself and Jefferson, given that he wrote legislative notes that went to people, or that he recounted what happened in those legislative debates, and he told other people besides Jefferson. And it seems like he might have told other people besides Jefferson with respect to the Constitutional Convention as well. And I know it's true that Jefferson couldn't have known that he was writing, or he was helping to write, the Constitution meaning our 2-century plus Constitution. But he was writing a Constitution, and he might very well have thought that someday it would be useful to have notes become public. Mary points out, to her credit, that legislative diaries in England had been published prior to the Constitution. And so people writing these legislative diaries may have originally thought they'd be for themselves and their friends, but they may have also thought that eventually they would get published. I had a friend in law school who kept meticulous notes of his classes, and he kept them in sort of very pristine condition. And he told me why he was doing this, and I think he said, this is my recollection at least, Oliver Wendell Holmes's law school notes were being used by scholars. And so I thought, some people really do think about the future, right? Now, it'd be great if my friend actually made it to the Supreme Court, but not yet. So I just don't know. Madison never tells us who the audience is for the convention notes. All we can do is speculate, and Mary's speculation is fine and interesting, but I don't really know how we can assume it's just Jefferson, just because it seems as if Madison only gave them to Jefferson. And I think it's possible that he meant to share them more widely. He doesn't, because I think of what Mary talks about in the penultimate chapter, he doesn't because the notes prove embarrassing to him. And I'll talk about that. Later. So what about the next topic? Madison's conspiracy of one. What has he done here? Heather says he's just sort of, revising and extending remarks. And we know that members of Congress do this in the congressional record, right? And it sounds pretty tame, revising and extending, but sometimes it's not really, revising is probably too polite a term. It's probably more serious than that. There's probably not really much revising at all. It's it's the same way that the Constitution amended the Articles of Confederation. It really was an amendment in the nature of a substitute rather than really an amendment. And when I look at what Madison did, I kind of think of him as the Richard Nixon of his era. If what Mary is describing is true, is he's taken the missing section of the tape and retape them and put them in as if nothing had happened. So I don't mean to be critical of him. I mean, we're all, no, I mean this, we're all human, but it's not just revising the remarks and adding a few little anecdotes and footnotes. It's actually something more serious than that, right? Because he substantively leaves out things that he said, as Mary points out, and then he adds other things that are designed, I think, to affect how we read the Constitution, right? What she calls interpretational comments. You know, someone says, well, of course it doesn't mean this. And someone says, of course you're right, right? It's like the sort of fake colloquy you sometimes see in Congress. Does the member mean that the bill suggests the following? Well, of course it doesn't mean that. And it's just two people in a room with no one else around, and no one else is paying attention. So this is an interesting point that Mary's brought up, because there's a fellow named William Krosky from University of Chicago. He's no longer there. He's not a fellow there. He was there. He was a former professor there. He's long passed. But he wrote a 3-volume treatise on the Constitution, and he called Madison a forger. He said his notes were deliberately false and misleading, and that he had invented spurious dialogue. And I think in some respects, Krosky, at least this particular claim, seems to be somewhat vindicated. Madison was naughty with these notes. He was a very naughty person. So when I write notes, right, when I write notes when I was a student, right, I would write notes. I wouldn't invent things that I said, right, or take things out that I said, right? And so it's a little. I mean, I think you all need to read. You know, there's a bunch of books. You guys need to get those books and read them, and you will see all the shenanigans that Madison pulled off. What about Madison's relevance? What about the notes' relevance? Mary says that the notes are more important, and I can't help but feel that they're less important. Because if I don't know which it's sort of like if I know now that, and I believe everything that Mary has told us, she's on to something great here. If I believe that, then there's also some possibility that other things he's saying are also sort of made up, right? And we can't necessarily separate fact from fiction. I'm not sure how we know any of the notes are legitimate, right? Because what she describes is a process where you take shorthand on one day, take shorthand on another day, take shorthand on a third day, and then on maybe the fourth day, you then write out the notes from your shorthand. Well, of course, you're going to be thinking about what transpired after the fact when you're transcribing that shorthand into long, legible notes. And that's going to affect what you write down. And as she points out, we don't have the shorthand notes. We don't have what he actually wrote down the first time. We have what he wrote down the second time, and in some cases the third and maybe the fourth time, right, when it was done years later. So I don't know what to make of these notes anymore. I don't know what to make of them. And I suppose that poses a challenge for people like myself who are originalists. What are we to do with these notes? And of course, originals have answers for everything, because that's the mindset we have. And I think some originalists who are public meaning folks will say, look, it's the objective meaning of the document. These notes don't matter. I had a professor at Yale, Akhil Amar. You think of him as a smarter, smaller version of myself. He told me these are secret debates. You should not be using them to figure out what the Constitution means. They were never made public at the time. No one had access to them. And so you shouldn't be reading them. So he said, this shouldn't matter. And so I think that's sort of a mistake, and I'll come to why in a second. But that was his view, and that was the view that Madison occasionally expressed when the notes didn't favor him or when the convention proceedings didn't favor them, right? He would sometimes say, oh no, don't think about what the convention did. Think about what the ratifiers thought. So we've got sort of three species of originalism, right? We've got original intent focused on the drafters of the Constitution. What did the drafters think they were doing? You've got original intent focused on the ratifiers. What did the ratifiers take the Constitution to mean? And then we've got these original public meaning folks who say, we don't care about the private intentions. We want to figure out what the objective public meaning was. If you believe that what matters is what the people at Philadelphia thought they were doing, then this is deeply problematic, right? That we've been using notes that are made up in part, right? That have false speeches and false interpretive claims. I guess for good or bad, most originalists don't believe that the intentions of the framers ought to matter. And they argue they ought not to matter in the same way that if a judge takes an opinion written by a clerk, it's the judge's understanding that potentially matters if you believe in intent, not the clerk's. Right? The clerk drafts something, maybe the clerk has something that he or she thinks the opinion means, but the judge is the one that's making it his or her own. And so this species of original intent folks think, no, forget the convention, let's look at what the ratifier said. And that's what Madison would say, as I said earlier, when he didn't like what the convention suggested for his argument. Well, what about those folks? Well, again, they can just say, these things don't matter, we can look at the ratifying conventions. But of course, there's an article by James Hudson, The Integrity of the Documentary Record, where he suggests there's problems with that record, right? That the ratifying conventions also weren't verbatim transcripts of of those debates, and they were full of inaccuracies. And so there's issues with that as well. The final group of people are these original meaning folks, and they say, well, we shouldn't be looking at what people thought they were doing. We should just try to figure out what this document would mean to someone who's well-versed in law in 1789. And of course, there are problems with this because this is a fictional person. There is no person you can ask and say, well, reasonable person from 1789, well-versed in the law, what does this provision mean? So what they then do is they look at all these documents, right? They look at these documents to try to figure out, well, what would a reasonable person think? But they're looking at these notes, right? So there's a piece by Michael Paulson and Vossen Kasevan that says we are original meaning originalists. We look at the public meaning. We don't look at private intentions. But we think it's appropriate to look at the Philadelphia Convention records. Why? Because they provide evidence of meaning independent of intent, right? The way people use words tells us something about what they mean. And I think I understand this argument. I even have some sympathy for it. But taken to its extreme, it means that even a fictional novel will be useful in deciding what words mean, right? Because it will reflect meaning. And after reading Mary's book, I wonder whether Madison's book has elements of a fictional novel. The final thing I want to say about about Mary's book and Madison's role in it is his switch in positions on the presidency, something that I write about from time to time. Madison enters the convention and thinks the federal government needs a strong executive, and he says the state executives are ciphers, meaning they're non-entities. And so he's consistently a voice for a stronger executive. And Mary recounts that he favored an executive during good behavior, right, which is basically life tenure at the convention. That's not a politic position to have during the ratification struggle. During the ratification struggle, the anti-federalists say, you've created a monarch. And Jefferson from France says, the presidency seems a bad version of a Polish king. He says that because the president's elected just like the Polish king is elected. And they are deeply distrustful of an elective monarchy because they think it's subject to intrigue and faction from foreign powers. So after the Constitution's created, there's still these struggles about how monarchical is the executive. And there's all these decisions early Congresses make with respect to the title of the president. Should he be called His Highness? With respect to judicial process, should judicial process issue from the courts in the president's name, even though the president has nothing to do with the judicial power? Or should it just issue in the court's name? The Senate wants it to issue in the president's name like it does in England. And the House says no. The Supreme Court says, fine, we'll have it issue in the president's name anyway. And so when you get a writ from the courts, it's written as if it's coming from the president. Of course, he has nothing to do with this. He's not seeing it and he's not signing it. But it's an odd way of doing things, and it's basically based on the English system. There are other things that they struggle over, right? Are they going to have annual messages from the president and responses from the chambers? This is said to mimic the English practice of addresses from the throne. And lots of people are unhappy with it, but they mimic it. And the final thing they think about is, are we going to have enacting clauses that mention the president, right? So now when you look at a statute, it says it's enacted by the House and the Senate. It doesn't mention the president. But there were people in the Senate who wanted to mention the president. And so there were all these efforts to make a monarchical president more monarchical still. And Jefferson was at the vanguard of opposing this. In his more candid moments, he would say our Constitution bears a mixed aspect. It's partly Republican, partly monarchical. And there'll be some people who want to make it more Republican and some people who want to make it more monarchical. But for the most part, after the Constitution, he's just railing against the monocrats and the people who want to make it a monarchy. And he's railing against Hamilton, who, like Madison, wanted to have a strong executive. And I think one of the things we learned from, Mary's book is that Madison basically does a 180-degree flip right after the Constitution and sides with Jefferson on a whole host of presidential issues, arguing for a weaker presidency, in part because that's Jefferson's preference. And I think Mary's book highlights the flip that Madison does and the measures he took to avoid the charge that he had changed his position. But thank you so much for inviting me, folks, and look forward to more.
Stuff you said about Madison. Let me also thank you for doing me the honor of inviting me to this event, the honor of being on this extraordinary panel with these great scholars and great friends, and the honor of being invited to talk about Mary's really, truly remarkable book. Mary described it, and some of the reviewers have described it as well, as a biography of Madison's notes, which of course it is. It's also in a lot of ways a biography of Madison, and one of the things that comes through in the book in a wonderful way is Mary's sympathy with Madison and her understanding of Madison, the sort of a biographer's understanding at a very deep psychological level, as Heather said, understanding him as a human being. And it's really great. I mean, there's one point where Mary describes Madison as being catty. That has to be a first, right? Doesn't that have to be a first? I mean, James Madison being catty like some teen texting? I guess he wasn't texting. Can you believe? But there's a lot of that in the book. A lot of "can you believe" in the book, and it's a particularly subtle and enlightening approach. And the reason I say that is because Madison's an icon. I mean, literally, not just figuratively. The Federalist Society logo, I believe, is a silhouette of James Madison. And the American Constitution Society, the liberal counterpart to the Federalists, when it was originally planned, it was called the Madison Society. So this guy has that sort of iconic status. And I have to say, when I first heard about Mary's project, before I saw any of the precursor papers or the book itself, of course, I thought, okay, this is great. She's going to smash the icon. But she's much more subtle than that. I mean, it's much more refined and subtle and nuanced than that, and really gives a sense of him that is not iconoclastic in any crude way, but does raise questions about exactly what do we make of Madison. Of course, Madison's not the only icon in the picture, and it's not the only really the subject of Mary's biography. The Constitution itself, in a sense, is her subject, and the Constitution itself is, of course, sort of an icon. It's sort of iconic. I mean, people talk about the Constitution with reverence. We read the Constitution. There's resort to the text of the Constitution. You might remember the House majority recently devoted a couple of sessions to reading the text of the Constitution. They got to some awkward provisions, and they kind of did a Madison to those awkward provisions. So the Constitution itself has this sort of status. Now, Mary's book raises, she says one of the questions that this book will raise, which she says I'm not going to go into a lot, is what are the implications of what I've found for the interpretation of the Constitution. And like a historian, she's not going to be a presentist about this and sort of trace out implications. That's a much more extended, really a different project from what she's engaged in, and really suitable for a cruder intellect, like, for example, mine. So let me sort of try to say what implications Mary's account might have for the interpretation of the Constitution. And I guess the place to start is to figure out what we're doing when we interpret the Constitution. I think one thing we do is we try to tell a coherent story. We try to pull some principles out of the Constitution. We don't just look at the words. We talk about the structure. We talk about the implications. We talk about the kind of government the Constitution is trying to set up, really to make it coherent. Madison did that sometimes. Sometimes he revised his notes in order to make things more coherent. Sometimes he made it coherent in one direction, and then when the wind shifted, made it coherent in another direction. Mary has this account of how Madison's account about presidential removal. The president has to have the removal power for various reasons that you can infer from the document. But when it came to the First Bank of the United States, he wasn't so interested in making these structural inferences from the document. And as she says, he was criticized for that. And I think one of the lessons of the book is that this sort of project of trying to make something coherent out of the Constitution was repudiated in words and acts by Madison. Mary has this line about how Madison moved from being an engaged participant to a person with omniscient hindsight, was her phrase, a person with omniscient hindsight, that Madison, after he left the Constitutional Convention, stopped being someone who was there engaged in the toing and froing and the fights that were on board, and kind of adopted this distant position. Well, now I can tell you what it's about. But he was imposing a coherence on it that wasn't actually there. This was something he was trying to do afterwards. Federalist 37, as Mary says, is really about this, really about Madison explaining, look, this is a document forged in various kinds of compromises. Don't expect it to be a work of perfect theoretical coherence. If you want a work of perfect theoretical coherence, you have to read a theorist, and the Constitution is not the product of the mind of a single theorist. The other sort of nice point that she makes, that Federalist 10, which is, I think, the most sort of celebrated of Madison's contribution to the Federalist Papers. Federalist 10 is the paper in which Madison argues against what was, in many ways, the conventional wisdom of the time, that a republic can be large. It doesn't have to be small. And in fact, he goes beyond that and says, in fact, a large republic has the virtue that factions will cancel each other out and no one will be able to dominate. And this is a sort of important theoretical contribution credited to Madison. And Mary says persuasively, he said that, but he was probably disappointed. I mean, he really thought there should be some way of dealing with faction other than just establish a large republic, and that his leading theoretical contribution of his was really a testimony to his own disappointment, in a way, that the Constitution hadn't managed to come up with a better way of controlling faction than simply being large. So there again, if you're looking for coherence, if you're looking for the Constitution as a product of a theorist, of a person with a coherent view, like as Madison is sometimes credited as having, you won't find it in the Constitution. That's what we learn. And of course, the revisions themselves are evidence of how this is not a coherent project. It wasn't that the Constitution came out of the convention a coherent whole, and Madison now presents it to us with its accompanying logic and its underlying principles. It's not like that at all. There's a process of kind of jiggling with it and adjusting it and fixing it and kind of saying, well, highlighting certain features and not other features, and claiming that it has certain features that it must not have. So what are the lessons of all this for us today? I think one of the main lessons I get out of this book is the lesson you get out of all great history, which is, these are wonderful stories, these are engaging stories, these are people engaged in a very human struggle with their own issues of their own times. That's what they were doing. They were dealing with their times. If you try to get them to speak to us, you're not treating them in the way they should be treated. That's one thing that comes through very strongly. The sort of general lesson that the past is another country, that there are lots of ways in which what they're doing was really quite alien to us, and something we have a very difficult time understanding, and the only way we can possibly understand it is to try to imagine ourselves in their position. Even then our understanding will be imperfect, but to imagine them to be addressing our problems today is just a formula for really abusing what they give us. And it's, this is another way in which Mary subtly tells us that in the book. There's no sort of element of, look here, he said this, that teaches us this lesson about today. She's not in that game, to her great credit. That doesn't mean we can't learn lessons from the past. Of course we can learn lessons from them. Of course we can see how they struggled with things. We can think about analogous struggles in our own time. We can think about the features of people engaged in political conflict, the psychological nature of these battles that these people had living in that time when they couldn't see what was ahead of them. We can think about all of that and use that to inform what we're doing today. But the ways in which we can use the past are very, very difficult to tease out, very complicated, and have to be handled with appropriate care. So the past can be used, but only very sparingly and only with those limits. And finally, the lesson I get from the book is, Madison was adapting the Constitution to the issues of the day. That's what he was doing when he was revising his notes. He was sort of trying to enlist the Constitution in his fights. As his fights went on, he was trying to enlist the Constitution. Not sort of say, not he was often purporting to say, oh, we settled that back then. But that's as Mary shows, it's not what he was really doing. What he was really doing was reshaping it after the fact in order to deal with what was going on. And I guess I don't have a problem with that. I guess that is within limits, and you'd have to think about exactly the extent to which it's appropriate. That's an okay way to use the Constitution, not to hold it up as the sacred icon to which we owe fidelity, but to realize it's something that is subject to being shaped and used in the ways that serve our needs today, just as Madison was shaping it right from the start in order to deal with the battles that he confronted. Mary says a couple of times in the book, and it's a great line, they didn't realize they were writing the Constitution until afterwards. Well, I'm not sure they ever wrote the Constitution. I think that's the one we have to write. Thanks.
You're seeing a great panel here, obviously. The next stage is to see if the panelists would like to ask any questions of each other, and then we'll move to the audience.
No, can I just say, Dan, those were first of all, three people who actually read the book. I'm so deeply appreciative. Even my own parents told me the cover looked beautiful, and they liked the acknowledgement to them. They were very grateful, and they looked forward to reading it, which I've learned are the famous words that you say when anyone sends you anything, is that you look forward to reading it. So I just want to say how grateful I am to all of you for reading it, and for being such thoughtful readers. And I think one of the most interesting things when you write a book is you write a book and then you kind of have no idea how anyone's going to read it. You write it and you have your own way of writing it, and you don't really know what it will mean to somebody else. And to have three people who I think's interests are very different in terms of constitutional law find something in it that was meaningful to them is to me the just greatest compliment anyone could pay me, and I'm just really appreciative.
Terrific. Yeah. And any questions here among the panelists? Oh, it's a very quiet panel. At this point, we can open it up then to the audience for questions from the audience. Don't be shy. I see some of my students out there. They always ask questions. Oh, come on. It's an intimidated audience. Yes, please.
So I'll ask you a question. Supposing that the issue that Madison was very concerned with, the difference between the Federalist and the Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution, what would you say are the major changes that favored the Jeffersonian side at the time? In other words, the major changes he made in the notes that would have, in fact, distorted the actual sort of debates. I'm looking for the big political points that come out of it.
Yeah. So I think the two pieces. I mean, there's other pieces, but I think the two really important places where Madison shifted in large and small ways the position that he had at the Constitution in order to align with Jefferson. First is the piece that Sai talked about. Madison he was most interested in the legislature, and then next he was interested in the executive, and he wasn't interested at all in the judiciary. But he was, I think, to my mind, even surprisingly comfortable with a strong executive. He didn't begin the convention that way, but I think he was comfortable with other people who sort of had come to think that a strong executive would be useful. And the Virginians actually, Madison among them, participated in this vote in July where they vote for lifetime tenure. and there's nothing they can do about that vote, because that vote they know is on the record. And so Madison spends an inordinate amount of time trying to explain that vote away. And it's actually the page of the notes that's most marked up. He eventually, like, writes a footnote explaining it really wasn't a vote for lifetime tenure. It was just, there was a whole complexity about term limits, which he was probably right about. I mean, I don't think he really wanted lifetime tenure, but it was a strategic vote. And then he realizes that's not very good. So then he says, well, it's actually this other thing. Eventually that page, he writes up the inner margin. And when he could no longer write, it's one of the places where we know that his brother-in-law wrote up the inner margin. So it's this vote he keeps trying to explain away. So, and it's the piece that Jefferson's horrified at when he comes back, that there were people at the convention thinking of a monarch. And so Madison's sort of like, you can tell, like, not me, I wasn't with them. And then I think for me, in terms of federalism, the equally interesting, but probably less easy to explain point is that there were, I think, a lot of people at the convention, I would put Hamilton, Wilson, Morris, that whole crowd, who and Madison very much so at the beginning, who were willing to contemplate the states being conceived of not as sovereign entities. And so you get language like they could be corporations, they need to be subordinate. And Madison goes into the convention with that view, and I think he gives speeches. Other people report him giving speeches with that. And when you look at the notes, you cannot find a single line left where Madison actually says the states could be corporations, even though other people had said that. And when he leaves the convention, everybody says, you said that. And he says, oh. And Jefferson comes back, and Jefferson is worried about national power, and Madison flips on that. And so I don't think he fictionalized his speeches completely. What I think he did was he dropped this conclusion out when he substituted new speeches. And so he prevented the notes from ever being able to be, in essence, used against him, being able to say, look, in your own notes with your own hand, you thought the states could be something like corporations. And I think in terms of the history of federalism, one of the things that maybe law professors don't see in the way that I think maybe I probably saw after looking at the notes is, we think everybody knows what a state is, but there weren't states. I mean, there were colonies, and then they haven't been states very long. And so the notion of what state means when they use the word state, we have assumed it means what we think it means. And so part of the thing that I came away from rereading Madison's notes was the sense that the word state exists, but its meaning is very up for grabs. And that's one of the things that Madison cares about trying to shift his understanding of.
Great question. Yes, in the back, Kent.
So, Sai, I want to hear more from you about the objective meaning and what. Sai and I go way back, and whether our increasing knowledge of the way the Constitution was drafted, how that can be reconciled with an objective meaning theory of intent. So, one thing. All history is subversive in a way, right? It's one thing that we know from Mary's work and others is that people had different views of a set text, right? The executive power shall be vested in a president, and some thought that meant A as opposed to 3, and some thought that no, it's the importance is that all executive power from all sorts, much more of a monarchy type of view. So I guess I want to hear from you, if the people at the time disagreed about the meaning, is there a way to get an objective meaning now, looking back?
Well, I don't want this to be about executive power, but I guess what I would say is the fact that people disagreed over some range, be it very small, or somewhat large, still limits what the clauses would have meant, right? In a way that's not true if you don't care about the meaning, the original meaning. And so there are certainly going to be instances where people are disagreeing about what something means. But I don't know if that dooms the project of objective meaning or semantic meaning. I think people talk about that even today, knowing full well that legal texts are typically authored by multiple authors. So it's not so much that we can always necessarily derive one meaning from a text, but I think at a minimum we can certainly limit the ambit, right? The Constitution isn't referencing pets or airplanes or televisions, right? Because none of those concepts are within any of the words. I think David's book is incredible. It's a wonderful book. But once you decide that you have a living Constitution, there are no boundaries to what a word can mean, and I don't think David suggests any in his book. If I could just comment quickly on David's point, and what's interesting here is that the originalist is the harshest person on Madison, I think, on the panel, and I think people are misperceiving what Madison did with the notes and what he did with them afterwards. He's not using the notes to help change the meaning of the Constitution. First of all, he's changing the notes, I think, to make himself look better, right? To make himself consistent with his post-constitutional self versus his Philadelphia self. But of course, those notes don't become public until after he dies. So it's not as if he's citing what he said in the convention during debates about the bank or debates about the presidency. It's really about his long-term legacy in a way. Did you have different views post the convention? And if David were right, what he'd be saying, I think, is something like, Madison would be saying something like the following: I believe in a living Constitution, therefore I think I should be able to make up things in the convention to give a different spin on the Constitution. But of course, if he believed what David thought, it wouldn't matter what the original meaning of the Constitution was, and you wouldn't bother changing the notes. Right? The fact that he changed them actually suggests that he thinks it mattered. Certainly it mattered in a minimal sense for his reputation, I would suppose. And I think this actually ties into the previous question. I guess I'd like to hear from Mary whether she thinks he was really Madison's changes were really designed to change our understanding of the Constitution, as opposed to changing our understanding of Madison and whether he was consistent or not over time.
First, let me let David respond to
Cross-responding.
Well,
Since David's book got thrown in there a couple
you know, I
times.
mean, it's complicated. I mean, sure, if Madison had a full-blown conception that this document is just a starting point, we're going to sort of evolve from here, and things will take on new meanings, and the Establishment Clause will take on a new meaning, and Congress and the first word of the First Amendment will no longer mean Congress, it'll now mean the federal government, and down the road it'll mean the states, and all this stuff. If he had that sort of full-blown conception, sure, he would have done something different. They're operating they're struggling. They're sort of trying to figure stuff out. This is all new, and I don't, Mary. I mean, I'll totally defer to Mary on this, but I think it is plausible to say that part of what's going on is Madison is trying to introduce, maybe only in his own thinking, an element of flexibility and give in the Constitution in order to acknowledge that, look, we didn't see everything coming. Stuff changes, or I changed my mind about some stuff. And of course, it would be wonderful if he laid all that out and said, the following things happened caused me to change my, as he sort of did about the bank in a way. The following things have happened caused me to change my mind, and therefore, although I said this in the convention, I now think this. But that's asking too much of someone who's in the middle of the struggle, both a political struggle, and a struggle of self-understanding. So that's why I guess I'm a little bit more charitable to Madison, whom I don't treat as an icon, unlike Sai.
I mean, I have to say,
Heather would like to say
when
something.
Sai was speaking, I was wondering why it was that the two of us were gentler on it. Was it because we're not originalists, or we just have a different conception of humanity?
We're nicer people.
Right.
We're
No,
nicer people.
I don't mean nicer, because I do appreciate. But one of the just a couple of data points about it is, I'm sure he was trying to present himself in a better way, as we all do. And it's just one example. We know how many people voted for John F. Kennedy. We know. The number of people who report themselves as voting for John F. Kennedy is enormously higher than the vote total, especially if we think about how many votes weren't real in Chicago. So there's just a way, and I actually don't think those people at the moment understand themselves to be lying or showing themselves a better selves, but when they want to reconstruct a narrative, or just same-sex marriage, just think about how radically different our world is right now and how we think about that question now. And I will bet you that everyone now wants to think of themselves as thinking differently than they probably did, because we know from public surveys. So that's a human tendency, so it's hard to blame Madison for that. But also I think that is the reason why I'm so skeptical of originalism, because things are endlessly contested, even within one person's own mind, and our evolving understanding, because as David says, we are always in the middle of something. It makes it very hard to imagine anything remotely stable coming out of it. Your example of airplanes, right, is the great example. We now have, it's not in the Constitution, but we have, it's constitutional, right? It's constitutional. We have navies there, and so now we have now we have an Air Force. What do we do about that, Sai? David has an answer. Do the originalists have an answer?
It was originally part of the Department of War.
Right. So this is called the level of generality game. You just move it up a level of generality, and then everything's fine. But I do think that in some ways that these two things are connected. That is, if you have a skepticism about whether or not history has a stable meaning, whether the present has a stable meaning for people, even even if you look back a few years later, then it's hard to sort of imagine placing your faith in something like that. Maybe yes as one tool, but as the only tool, it's a struggle.
Mary, you'd like to?
No, I feel like I should defer to everybody who teaches con law on when I was.
This is our Marshall McLuhan moment. You know that line in Woody Allen where, like, what does Marshall McLuhan think? Well, you can't.
You know nothing of my work.
Sharon?
Look, I'll just say one thing, which is, and this is maybe a piece for me that I didn't, because people don't write about this moment who are interested in constitutional interpretation. So, I think David's right that in some ways it's also a history of the Constitution at the very beginning as it becomes to be the Constitution. Because I think that's what for me was interesting about Madison, that they literally, I have this line in the book, they couldn't see it till the final day. And I actually mean that quite literally. Literally, they cannot see the Constitution structured the way we see it, arranged the way we see it, until the week before, 3 or 4 days, the Committee of Style comes back. It's completely reconfigured. And then they just vote like, oh yeah, sure, fine. And so there's a way in which so much of the way we understand the Constitution comes from this final draft, committee draft. And they're leaving. They want to leave. They're going home. They're, whatever. So there's this way in which my own personal non-constitutional law professor thing is people don't wrestle with that issue enough in terms of understanding the Constitution. How much of the ways we read it come from a certain arrangement that literally nobody knew was coming down the pipeline until right before. And then similarly, the other piece that's hard for me, that would be hard for me if I taught constitutional law, which tell the associate dean I'm never planning to teach, so I won't have to have this problem, is I personally believe Madison did not think the convention, or even maybe the Constitution itself, was set in a certain way until they're fighting over amendments. And Madison wanted the amendments to be interwoven into the Constitution. And that would mean that the Constitution was amended the way we tend to think of statutes being amended. And the Constitution would have read, and I think been interpreted completely differently if we had always updated it like that. And instead, Roger Sherman says, in kind of, this is a paraphrase, I think that's a bad idea. We ought to tack all the amendments on the end. Otherwise, there will be some confusion about how the text is being amended. And then everybody else was like, well, don't you think there's going to be some confusion tacking them on the end? And they're like, yeah, probably not. Who knows? We'll vote it through. Okay, so the Constitution gets amended, and Roger Sherman at the moment says we cannot amend the Constitution by interweaving because the Constitution's sacred. And it's actually one of the first moments where you see the Constitution conceptualized this way. And this is 1789, and they've already got the government up and running. And for me, that moment also brings this issue of, well, up until that moment, it's not clear what the Constitution looks like. And so I think one of the things that very much I came away from following Madison through this was that the way we, originalist or not originalist, understand the Constitution is a product of some decisions that post-date that summer of 1787. And I don't know how one would deal with that, but I just do think we can't help but read the Constitution with these big structuralist things. So I don't know what that has to do with anything if I taught con law. But I think those are two very tricky moments that you have to kind of work your way around in terms of understanding what people at the time thought.
Sharon?
So Heather's bringing in the concepts of human psychology, right, and how we're always reconstituting everything as we go along, illustrates really clearly how impossible the job of a legal historian is, or any kind of historian, because you're a human being and you're trying to do that. And I found it really cool that these three remarkable scholars who disagree with each other about many things, all in your own way commented on what a good job Mary did with that project, how she approached it, not with an agenda, but with a curiosity and a quest to discover, and doing all the really hard work to discover. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit, I mean, maybe it's self-evident from your comments, but talk a little bit more about the importance of her work in that regard, how important it is to have legal historians that you can rely on, and what the significance then is of her work in that way.
I don't see how anyone can read those notes and think of them in the same way again. I mean, it's a revolutionary change in the way we think of those notes and the way we think of Madison, right? The father of the Constitution is not rewriting the Constitution, but revising and extending his remarks well after the fact, years perhaps after the fact, and so it's utterly phenomenal, right? What she's done, and you can tell there's no agenda. I think other than being a little kind to Madison, there is no agenda. There is no agenda.
I read a deep-seated hatred of Jefferson in it, but that's only because I'm imposing my own narrative on this one. I actually, for me, it's the quality. For me, the book was really marked by a certain quality of mind, because you have to be thinking at every single level. And I will say that the hard thing about being a legal historian is that you need to sort of be able to sort of do the craft of history in a way that your peers who are historians believe in it. But meanwhile, law professors are always thinking about these sort of broader conceptual and normative categories, and she was playing at every level and in a really interesting and evocative way. And so this is a storyline that you could just go down rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and yet it was a completely engaging read to someone like me who doesn't really care at all about originalism, who's modestly interested in Madison, wants to find hateful things about Jefferson. But I was really learning and engaged with that from beginning, and then thinking about all the ways in which I'm going to teach con law differently. Unfortunately, I've already finished with McCulloch and everything else. But it's really that's a remarkable achievement, and very few legal historians, very few people who have the mind to be great historians, have the mind to do both of those things at the same time.
I'm just gonna echo what Sai and Heather say, which is actually good career advice for any aspiring academic. I think law exerts a corrupting influence on history, and I think it must be overwhelmingly tempting, whatever at a subconscious level, for historians to try to write things that will play into legal disputes, because you get noticed that way. And if you are really trying to stay true to the past and true to the craft, there's a risk it'll come across as sort of just, only 5 people who read this. So I think, when I first heard about this project, part of me thought, this is great. She's going to debunk Madison, and she's going to debunk originalism, and that'll be great. There's Exhibit A. And what I think what the magnitude of the accomplishment is, she doesn't do any of that. That's really not in here. If you're trying to read this book and say, okay, what are you up to? What's this lesson? What's your agenda? What are you trying to accomplish? What are you telling us about these debates today, about anything, not just the big originalism versus living constitutionalism, but any of the executive power, or any of these debates? You don't get an answer. But at the same time, it's really great to read. It's really fun and engaging and interesting. And I actually attribute that, the part that really grabbed me about the book was, as I said in my in my remarks was the sort of quasi-biographical part about Madison. I really thought Mary was in touch with Madison on some very deep level, and really kind of got him, and doesn't portray him as a bad guy. Doesn't portray him as sort of a dishonest guy particularly, but really sort of understood the psychology. And I think, for me at least, that's what made it both really gripping and also admirable in the way that it stayed out of the presentist playing legal controversy, stayed out of that game.
I was just going to,
Can I just say one
sure.
thing? So I actually think I had an agenda. I just don't think it was the agenda that anybody would care about. But here's the agenda that I do think I came to believe in writing the book. I think the convention has been captured over the last 30 years as if the only thing that matters about the convention is how do people back then answer modern day legal problems for the court. And for me, the convention was just this remarkable moment where people really tried to say, I mean, the fact that you even get the Constitution is incredible. The fact that the country doesn't split into 3 subparts, which a lot of people thought was probable. The fact that the convention was a major political event matters to me, and that people bargained in a way that we would be uncomfortable with in all sorts of ways, and there were horrible compromises, and individuals mattered. And so I think if I had an agenda, it was very much to restore to the convention the reality that it was a political event, and it wasn't just a bunch of people trying to come up with legal principles to live in our time. And that I think that matters to me because I think there's a way in which the story about the convention as a group of quasi-gods, demigods, as Jefferson called them, which I always thought was suspiciously close to demagogue, which might have been Jefferson's little point also. I think that's paralyzing as a country. I think to have a mythic heritage in which some people solve problems for all time, and then our only job is to sort of behave that way, I think is paralyzing. And I think that it is terribly important to understand the convention as people struggling and individuals mattering at a time politically. I also thought, on a very personal note, Madison, who's everybody's law professor's favorite founder, who I couldn't identify with Madison at all, I have to say. I mean, partly I'm a woman, so that probably complicated the issue. But he's in all sorts of ways very complicated for me. The one thing I completely identified with and I kind of wanted to redeem was, in history, all the guys who get a lot of press are people who finish projects perfectly at the time, you know? Like, and the notes looked like this, and so in some ways I wanted to redeem people who it takes a long time to they're not quite sure what they're writing, you know, it takes them 30 years to do it how they like it. The sort of, you know, as Heather said, the sort of human side of him seems to me to be very important. But I don't think I can be thought of as agendaless. I just think it might not be the right agenda.
I was looking to Vlad to see how many questions. It turns out he wants to ask a question. Yes.
I actually have one question. You write about the logistics of note-taking, but not about the fact that he took notes. And I wonder if, to some extent, he lost some of the battles during the convention, because when you take notes, it takes time. You can't schmooze with people. You can't make eye contact. You can't go to them, put your arm around them and chat with them. So I just wonder if is that because he wasn't an operator, or why was it that he did that thing, which places you in a particular, in the landscape of what goes on. And then the second one is that the Clough Center will fund in perpetuity a project that you might want to do on the dirty little secrets between Jefferson and Madison. Anything that you can dig out. The American people deserve to know.
No, I mean, I think Madison was a person who thought through writing, and he loved politics. He's much more similar to sort of George Stephanopoulos, Karl Rove, people like that than
some great political thinker in his closet. And he actually always, it drove him crazy that Jefferson kept criticizing the Constitution for theoretical reasons, particularly given that he was in France at the time. And Madison would write back like, okay, what, sort of, dude, what are you talking about? This is like politics. And so he was intensely political. But I actually think you're right. He thought he was sophisticated about coalition building. But he wasn't sophisticated, I think, about coalition building in a personally compelling sense. So one of the things that frustrates him immensely is he perceives proportional representation to be the right answer. He literally cannot understand why the states should be represented in the national government. It's just baffling to him, and he cannot understand why anybody thinks that the states should be represented in the national government. And right at the beginning of the convention, everybody keeps counting votes, they keep counting. And they keep counting proportional representation, and by any means, that means the Virginians win. And the Virginians win way more than everybody else. So everybody keeps saying, we're not gonna let you guys win everything. And Madison doesn't get this. And people say at the very beginning, you're gonna have to compromise this. And he just doesn't get it. And when he does decide to compromise it, he decides to throw slavery on the table and try and get the slave states to agree to proportional representation. And it's a terrible compromise. But he thought, like many a political person, I think thought he was better at politics than he was at analyzing politics. And maybe he deserves to be the first great political analyst because he was like that. But when you're taking notes, you are wasting a lot of time. I'll tell one thing. I had to give a talk at the Second Circuit Judicial Conference, and the topic was Madison and the judiciary. And they're like, so tell us what Madison said at the convention. And I was like, he actually didn't say anything. You can't tell Second Circuit judges that Madison actually didn't care at all about them whatsoever. So I had to pretend that he said something.
See, yeah. Sai, this is what happens.
Yeah. Well, you should have told him it was a little-known secret that he really was interested in circuit court judges.
Inferior federal courts.
Yes, inferior federal courts.
Yeah. Vlad, what do you think? A couple more questions? Yes, please. Come on.
So I have yet to read the book, but I am really looking forward to it. And I wonder, this may be in it, but I wondered if you could say a little more about your relationship with originalism. You've said already what your agenda was, and I imagine in your field that you need to have a stance towards originalism. And I was just curious as to how you actually go about settling the questions that originalism demands, and whether you have to, as a constitutional historian in the United States, engage with what it is that originalists are most intent on finding out. And if you could say a bit more to it about your choice of writing, I mean, you mentioned placing the Constitutional Convention in a particular light, but writing about the notes that Madison was taking.
Yeah. So, I mean, originalists. Some of my best friends are originalists. I mean, you gotta love originalists if you do legal history of this period, because they're the only people who are interested in it. So they write you really awesome notes. You publish some obscure thing on, how the journal was taken, and you get notes from like every originalist, like awesome piece, really loved it, and they're super careful. So it's like, footnote 12 was particularly helpful to me. Nobody else reads it, so it's great. And I also think what Sai said is actually right, which is why I don't have a stance on it, and it's not just a cop-out. I gave an early version of this paper at Illinois, and Larry Solomon was there, and he drove me around, I think deliberately, never finding my hotel. Well, he kept saying to me, your book is going to support us. He's a word guy. I don't know what
He's
you
a
guys
semantic
call him now.
public meaning
Yeah,
person.
I don't know. He's evolved over the years. So semantic public meaning guy. And he's like, this is awesome. It's going to support us. And I'm like, really? Because part of the book keeps talking about how words are shifting meanings very quickly, like by 1789. And he's like, no, it's going to support us and everything. like that. And then another unnamed here originalist was like, your book's going to support us too. And I was like, really? Because I wouldn't necessarily think that. But so I've come to the conclusion that like originalists can work with anything. And, and my book will be revised by them to fit whatever needs it needs. It needs to bear. And that's I don't think that's a problem actually. I mean, I would obviously I don't think I'd reach a lot of the same conclusions, but I think if people pause and struggle a little bit more, I'd be happy with it. I mean, within people who write history here, there's this thing that everybody's like, oh, it's law office history. That's what you say about lawyers who use history. But as a husband who works in a law office, I'm always like, that's actually pretty good history sometimes. So I refuse to be against it. My own guess is that in the long run, it will make it more uncomfortable for people to do a certain kind of originalism, and what the long-term consequences of that are, I don't know. But in this generation, I think people have been enormously creative as originalists.
So that doesn't sound very good. I think what we'll do is we'll just take out some pages of your book and put them we'll make it work.
Ray Madoff, yeah?
So, Mary, could you take what you've done with Madison's work and turn it now onto your own work, which is, to what extent has your book changed over time? You worked on it for a long period of time, and did it shift, or did you know that this was the book you were going to write when you started to write it?
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I had little kids, as Ray knows, and the original version of this book was, I planned never to do any research. I was going to sit in my office. I was trying to come up with a book that a legal historian could write that was like the kinds of doctrinal pieces that law professors write, where you sit in your office and you don't have to go anywhere. And so I thought, hey, there's Madison's notes, but no one's ever read it, just sort of interpreted it as a thing. And so I thought that'll be easy, requires no research. I'll just read it, and then I'll just interpret it, and I'll be home for 5 o'clock, 5:30 for dinner with my daughters. And I think one of the things that happened to me, it's what happened to Krosky, I think, although he couldn't figure out why, is that when you spend a lot of time reading the notes, particularly when you go back and you look at the original transcript, you notice funny things about the notes. I mean, you can't help but notice funny things, and so it was in puzzling over those funny things that this book came out. This was not the book I wanted to write. I thought seriously about publishing it posthumously. I was like, that will be much easier. If I'm horrifically wrong, I won't ever know. And I think of all the moments when I was most sympathetic to Madison was at some very down moments where I thought, oh, I understand the whole like wait till you're dead, because no one can know. So the book, I think the book changed a lot over time. I think the struggle that Heather talked about was the biggest struggle, which was, and I'm not sure it's wholly successful, but trying to retell the story of the notes with enough information about the convention that somebody could follow Madison through the convention, and that took many drafts. And I'm very happy it's through. And there's pictures in it, which is the thing I'm most proud of in the book. This is the picture that I wanted. This is why occasionally your publisher is completely right. I wanted the cover of this book to be the very young James Madison. This is what he looked like at the convention. He looked much younger than he was, and I thought then the book would really make the same point, that this is not the Madison you know, because this is somebody who doesn't look like Madison. And my publisher said, no one will buy the book. You have to sell the book with a picture of the Madison that we know for posterity's sake. You can't have a clever cover. So anyway, I think we should come to a close myself.
Yes, if I'd said one more question, did I see a hand over there? We're all set. Thank you. This is terrific. Absolutely great.